Oh, we are live. All right, fantastic. Well, welcome. Fantastic. Welcome to the final panel session of NestGen 23. Once again, I'm your moderator, Jason Sansucci. I'm the chief architect at Juniper Unmanned. It is my pleasure to introduce you to this esteemed panel of CXOs, CEOs, CTOs of some of the top drone companies around the world. So I am really pleasure. I'm just going to go around the horn. We have a very fantastic session on BVLOS and drone-in-a-box solutions from a CXO perspective for you today. So we're very happy that you're here. If you have questions for the panelists, please use the section, the Q&A section on the right. Otherwise, we're just going to dive right in. But first, let me introduce each individual panelist, and then we're just going to dive right in. So first up, obviously, no particular order. I'm just going around my screen. We have the CEO of Flightbase, our gracious host, Nitin Gupta. And then we also have the CEO of Hover UAV, Jackie Dumovic. There we go. I got it. Literally just practiced this. We have the CTO of DroneUp, John Vernon. Pleasure to have you, sir. And the CEO of BVLOS Aerospace, Glenn Lynch. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. I am very excited about this. There's a lot of buzz generating about this particular session. So now it is time, and I hope you are ready. Let's dive into question number one. So the first question. So how, and we're not doing this in any particular order. I'll just pick you randomly. I like it better that way. How can companies and governments work together to create a regulatory environment that both encourages innovation and growth and experimentation with BVLOS and drone-in-a-box technology, but also ensures public safety and security? And what are sort of the challenges and opportunity related to that? You know what? Let's go with John. Oh, John, I think if you're speaking, we can't hear you.
All right, how about now?
Perfect.
Look at that. The amazing problems of virtual conferences. So I guess thank you for the question, Jason. It's an interesting and multifaceted kind of question that you're asking there. Obviously, I think we talk a lot about the benefits and capabilities that are created with BVLOS and drone-in-a-box, and various different regulatory environments obviously are in very, very different kind of states of moving that forward. I'm sure Jackie has a very, very different perspective than kind of what's here in the U.S. and Glenn in Canada, seeing very different kind of things there as well. But I think to answer your question, I think the core of this is like we need really two things. One, we need industry drivers. We need people that are willing to go out and actually do the work, do the integrations. There's certainly pathways that have been in various different states of being established. But regardless of whatever state it is, nothing moves forward without driving innovation and creating economic opportunity. At the end of the day, all of this is about kind of risk versus reward, right? And so we have to continue to push forward for innovation in the space. Continue to create economic opportunity, and then partner with regulators to kind of not only show them why it's important, but how we can do it safely. And I know that's a fairly super high level answer because we don't have a ton of time, but I'm sure your future questions will get into some more of those details.
Oh, absolutely. You did mention Jackie. So Jackie, he mentioned your perspective. What is your perspective on this question?
Look, I because we more help people with that regulatory aspect and how to obtain it. I think that we need to work with the regulators. I think it needs to be a regulator-driven regulatory roadmap. We have just done one here in Australia, but we need to know what is their priorities. Is it airspace integration or what it may be? Because we need to know where they're going to spend the resources on it as well. So we know when they're expecting, to be full autonomy, or they're just focusing on AAM, because we don't want to spend, or like the clients or the people or the manufacturers don't want to spend on the wrong thing as well. We also need to see, I'm thinking especially for Australia, we need to further develop standard scenarios. So, people already know what is that minimal acceptable level of compliance so that we can continue to grow.
I think that's really great. And like I said, we're going to dive a lot deeper into these. But I mean, this is a tough question to answer. Over to you, Glenn.
So creating an environment that encourages innovation and experimentation, I have to say, after 40 years in aerospace and aviation, I don't think I've ever seen the level of cooperation I'm seeing currently. I think the key challenge is misalignment. We've got an industry focused on technology and a government body focused on safety. And I think John and Jackie both kind of led to the idea of partnering with the regulators, because I think the solution here is to make sure we invite the government early, invite the regulators into our process, understand the regulations and the government concerns, and then address those throughout the entire process through transparency and partnership with the regulators.
One thing that was brought up during your keynote, Nitin, is it wasn't necessarily the regulations; it was the bureaucracy. What were your thoughts on this particular question related to that during the keynote?
Right, Jason. So when we think about regulations and safety, all of these things, if you look at any of the regulators, they are always trying to do an assessment of the risk, right? And everybody understands that nothing comes with zero risk. There is always some non-zero risk. But the idea is, how can we evaluate that risk and how can we ensure that it is below a certain threshold? Right now, when you think about opportunity in this space, the opportunities will be creating these kind of risk models. Can we come up with risk models where you are able to put in all kinds of data? Now, this data could be internal, external, like it could be related to the type of vehicle or how it is operating, or what kind of parachute does it have? Does it have sense and avoid? All of these things can feed into that model, plus the environment that it is operating in. Is it operating in a dense area, in a sparse area, or it is operating in a high wind condition, and so on. So all of these things go into some sort of a risk model. And if we can build these things and come up with quantitative ways of coming up with a number and say that this is the level of risk, and work with the regulators to come up with a threshold that, okay, if this computed risk is below this number, then we are good to fly, right? So we see that is how things will probably evolve in the future. Like as more and more people in the industry work together, we will be able to come up with these models and convince the regulators to use these quantitative ways of evaluating risk. And future of the technology, if we just go a few steps further, you can imagine that at some point in time there will be enough AI and other things available, which will not only do a dynamic evaluation of this risk during the flight, but it will also suggest or execute things in order to mitigate that risk. Like, for example, if you're operating at a certain speed and suddenly the wind conditions change or something happens which makes it more risk than what is the threshold of the regulators, now your systems might automatically adjust the speed of the vehicle or the height of the vehicle or something else in order to bring that risk below that threshold, right? So you can imagine a future where we are doing this dynamic computation of risk and adjusting all these variables during flight in order to mitigate and keep the risk under that threshold. So and this is something that has to be driven by the industry. We cannot assume or think that regulators will come up with these models or these approaches. This has to be done by all of us together, making our systems where we are able to take in all this data. We have protocols, we have standards of collecting all this data, putting it into this model, and then once we have all these things kind of figured out together as an industry, we can go to the regulators and convince them that this is the approach that makes sense, and you can now validate whether this approach makes sense and turn it into a regulation. So long term, looking out 10 years from now, something like that is what we see happening. Sorry for a long answer.
No. And I'm actually want to dive a little bit deeper into this, into our second question. And we could, and please, if you have follow up to this, we can add it.
Jason, can I just add one thing to Nitin's thing on that? Look, I 100% agree with that. And we were really lucky, like in Australia last year, we, along with ANRA, won a very large grant to do exactly what you said. So for the next 18 months is to come up with that risk profiling. Not me. To automate that, automate that risk assessment process. So hopefully it's that start of, that longer journey of what we need and what you've said at the end. Sorry, Jason, go back to you.
Oh, no
Jason,
worries. And like I said, I want this to be an open dialogue as well. So we're not just going in any order. Or if there's comment that we want to do it, please.
I would add one other thing. Like it's because we also often get hung up in the regulatory side of kind of what needs to get done, and it's easy to do lots of these kind of projects to prove capabilities and talk about things that might happen at some point 10, 20 plus years out. But the other side of this that I think has to be factored in is kind of this community acceptance side of it, right? And at the end of the day, a risk equation is not really a well-factored risk equation if it doesn't say what is the drivers behind why we want to do this, what risk are people willing to take in order to accommodate, right? Because that is the reality. It's like every day we get in a car, it's far more risky than getting in a plane. But if you ask the average person, it's far scarier to get in a plane than a car. Why is that? They've just decided that that's an acceptable risk and that the convenience of getting around in a vehicle is something that they're willing to kind of accept. And so the same scenario is here. It's not just a regulatory scenario or an industry scenario. It's kind of all three of those factors that have to come together that drive the necessity that create a certain amount of acceptance. And then the other piece of this is what is reasonable regulatory constraints or rules or regulations that help ensure the level of risk that we're willing to accept.
Well, let's dive a little bit into the mindset then. So you brought that up. That's a good point, John. There seems to be a little bit of a clash between sort of the agile methodologies of technology companies. I asked this in an earlier panel, and I really like the answers. I wanted to get your perspective on this. Between agile technology companies and sort of the comparably slow-moving aviation industry, how do we bridge that gap between those two worlds and two mindsets? Let's start with Jackie.
Okay. Well, what is aviation? Like, what is the slow aviation group? Is that just the regulators? Like, are we all now, all part of aviation? And I'm not. I try to move very fast. But look, how we currently work, with those agile tech companies and things like that, is to do it back. We look at what is the purpose of what's that concept of operations that they want to do, or what does that end user want to do with that? Look at that level of risk, which always then defines out, what are those safety objectives or what are the technical specifications. And then we look at it, this is what they want to do now. So we can say, yep, this is what the regulator will accept now so they can move quicker just to get those runs on the board. And then, you can divide through the high level of risk, you're going to need these technical specifications. But that's going to take a lot longer because a lot of the issues, not just in Australia, I think all around the world, there is no minimal acceptable levels of compliance for a lot of even the technical specifications, or, there are some pathways for certification, but the regulator need to have that, what are they going to accept? What is the standards for detect and avoid, or whatever it be, so we can keep moving forward. But I'll let everyone else talk now.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Let's jump to Glenn. I'd like to get your thoughts, sir.
So bridging the gap, I mean, I kind of come from that lethargic world of aviation. To me, as drones get bigger and more capable, the gap between crewed and uncrewed airplanes start closing anyways. I think in the case of BVLOS, we actually operate helicopters and fixed wings as well as drones. Well, drones is the majority of our fleet. We're actually working hard to close that gap through cross-training between the companies. We've got people that come from the drone world working in traditional aviation, and traditional aviation people migrating into the drone world and kind of bridging that gap. That's dealing with kind of the future of the larger drones, I think, especially. But in the smaller drones, I think we also have an interesting challenge. And again, drones have kind of come up through technology world, and aviators have kind of come from that lethargic, decades old regulatory environment, and they're kind of coming together. One thing that I think has separated us for a while is the difference between analog and digital, right? In fact, the drone industry started digital, whereas the aviation industry is built on an analog framework. I think aviation is rushing very quickly to catch up. we're traveling across the ocean now, and rather than talking on HF radios, the most important things we do now is 3 buttons: accept, reject, and insert. That's it, right? So it's all digital, or it's getting that way. I think a lot of those problems are being addressed by the UTM community and companies focused on the UTM community. But I really believe fundamentally it begins with, cross-training and educating right now, and starting to see the industry through, each other's eyes. The drone community seeing it through conventional aviation. We need to do that because that's where the regulators are coming from. And then, of course, the regulators trying to understand the drone industry better as well, because it's a change for everybody.
I completely agree. And well put. Nitin, what is your perspective there at Flightbase?
Right. So again, we believe that both regulators and industry need to work with each other in order to bridge the gap. Of course, that's the given. But how do you really do it? And one thing that industry has learned is what you cannot measure, you cannot improve. Right. So we are highly data driven in everything that we do. However, if you look at the regulators and how regulations are handled today, it's very qualitative. It's not very quantitative today. So that is where we need to work with the regulators, understand their concerns about risk and everything, and then maybe help them come up with quantitative ways of evaluating and assessing risk, right? Because once you put a quantitative framework around this, it becomes so much easier for everyone to comply with it. And it is a very clear decision-based framework instead of a feeling-based framework, right? So that is where I think expertise of the industry and experience of the regulators, all that can come handy in order to design such kind of a measurable framework which can help move everyone ahead faster.
All right, so John, we're coming to you to wrap this question up, but very curious at your thoughts.
Yeah, so I always get concerned when people use the word agile because it's so hard to know exactly what they mean. I also get worried when people think that agile products or agile development doesn't create reliable products. And I think the core of it is exactly what Glenn was saying. I think he's right. There's a technology side of this equation, and there's a traditional aviation side of this equation. I could go and say things like, well, if we had waited for the Wright brothers to get it right to the level that we need to have it now, we'd still not be flying, right? But that's not super helpful. But the reality is if I really look at it, if you think about agile as a methodology, there are definitely ways and tenets that agile does actually help the industry. The idea of rapid experimentation, to Nitin's point, being able to quantify down to exactly, how well did we do and how much do we need to improve, the ability to kind of drive those things through, ongoing evolution. But at some point, you do have to meet a certain set of milestones, and that is where, meeting in the middle, so to speak, in terms of regulatory constraints, is exactly where we need to be. Some of the most reliable systems in the world were built with agile as the mindset, right? Things we rely on every single day and we don't think about it. The core of this isn't, is it slow or is it fast? It's that it needs to be a little bit of both, right? We need to be able to provide the best capabilities and the best quality systems that we can. And the old ways of waiting 4 years or 5 years to certify something don't necessarily support that, right? Things are changing much faster. Look at cases like LiDAR, right? Go to the trade shows 5 years ago and look at LiDAR equipment, and you could barely carry it around in a truck. I'm exaggerating a little, but now you've gotten to the point where you've got LiDAR where it's at swap sizes that you're carrying it around on a reasonable sized drone. 5 years from now, if you forecast into the future, those things will have evolved and changed as well. And so there has to be this meet in the middle of not just is it agile or is it not, but how can we adopt the right ways of building quality into the system, building capabilities into the system, regardless of the methodology that gets us to the end. It's not about taking shortcuts. It's about doing it the right way quickly.
So
Jason,
this is sorry, was there another comment on that?
Yeah, Jason, there was a comment that I read on one of the boards here from a distinguished guest, and I think it's important. Aviation is probably the worst industry on planet Earth for acronyms. And there was a question about BVLOS. And just to be clear, and first of all, I'm really grateful to the distinguished guest that actually brought that up, because it's a bad habit. We're talking about flight that's beyond visual line of sight is what we're referring to. And I think I'm going to do a little bit better of making sure I avoid stepping in the acronym trap here. We've got a pretty diverse audience, and I'm really grateful that point was brought up.
Same. Yeah, absolutely. I saw that as well. I saw that Danielle handled the question in there, but I'm glad we brought it up here for those that didn't see that. So yeah, thanks, Glenn, for pointing that out. Let's put our future looking caps on. This is why y'all make the big bucks. So let's look out 10 years, 20 years. I'm curious. So now as beyond visual line of sight and drone in a box technology becomes more prevalent, what are the potential risks associated with, because this is an automation conference. They're like, one of the main reasons we're doing this is for automation. As it becomes more automated, how can we ensure that there's enough oversight and accountability? How do we make sure that those are still key priorities? And I'm going to go ahead and start with Nitin with this particular question.
Right. So see, automation is not something that is happening for the first time. I mean, everything that humans have built over last so many years, everything has been automation compared to whatever existed before that, right? So when automobile were invented, people used to maybe use horse carts or something, and all that was automated by the automobile, right? So everywhere we have been working on reducing human effort or doing things in a way where we don't have to be involved in every micro decision of making something go from place A to place B, but we are going at higher levels of decision making, right? And with every such leap, we have to be able to design systems to the level of reliability and robustness so that we can let the machines take those low-level decisions for us, and we only care about the high-level decisions. And then the accountability is reduced to ensuring the reliability of the machine itself, ensuring that machine actually obeys the command. If you press the accelerator, it actually accelerates. If you press the brakes, it actually stops, right? And if the machine is able to, or you're able to design the machine to the specs and ensure that level of reliability or assurance that if you give this instruction, this is what will happen, then humans can be relieved from that level of accountability, etc. So humans can be left accountable for the high level decisions. So we see something similar happening, that more and more tasks will be left for machines to do, and we will have to build our processes and certifications and regulations and everything to ensure that those machines are actually doing what they are supposed to do, and reduce the level of accountability of humans to the high level tasks.
During our pre-meeting, well said. And during our pre-meeting, Jackie, you had an interesting answer to this particular question, and I'm hoping you sort of remembered it. So I'm going to go to you next. Would love to hear your perspective.
I don't even remember what I said, so I believe it. We need a high level of robustness, like proven robustness of systems. So, if it's the, hardware, the software, the communications, the associated equipment, we need to know that they're reliable. Like at the moment, like a lot of companies we see focusing on something called one-to-many. So one-to-many is, one pilot or remote pilot, like doing monitoring or meant to be piloting multiple aircraft at one time. So a lot of companies start with 2 to 4, then it moves up to 50, I've seen sort of getting approved. So what are you monitoring, and when does that human machine interface? So, after 10, you're just monitoring non-conforming actions. The computer's doing everything for you. So when does it actually move to autonomous? So, and when can that pilot then be removed? So that's what I still don't think there is quite known. But it's definitely at the moment, in the next year or two, it's how do we manage non-conforming rather than piloting the aircraft.
That's why I liked your question and actually set up the next question. But before we get there, let's get the takes from our other esteemed panelists. Glenn, would love to hear your thoughts on this question.
So, yeah, it's a familiar problem in aviation. It's certainly not new. If we go back as far as 1995, American Airlines 965, that was the Cali-Columbia crash that killed everybody on board because the airplane took a hard left turn and descended on the wrong side of the mountain before the crew figured out where it had decided to go and told it to do something different. Now, back in those days, we're taking pilots again out of a very analog environment and training them to fly in this new digital cockpit, right? And American Airlines actually kind of took the problem to task, and they put out a training program. It was called Taming Automation. And that's literally was kind of, from my perspective, the move towards learning how to manage automation properly. Because sometimes the correct level of automation is no automation, and sometimes it's completely integrated, where we're basically doing nothing more than monitoring what the aircraft, manned or otherwise, is actually doing. I think the drone industry in general is ahead of the game there, because largely it started very early on with automation. But I don't think there's anything that will ever substitute for a well-trained operator pilot supported with good SOPs and best practices.
Absolutely. And one of the things that came up in the earlier panel, and I really appreciated it, was that there's actually a triad here. It's a triangle. It's the operators or operations, there's the technology, and there's bureaucracy / regulators. There's that operations piece. And like I said, we're going to bring that up in the next question as well. But before we do that, John, bring us home.
Yeah, so one of my favorite books is by a gentleman named Daniel Burrus. It's called Flash Foresight. It's effectively about how you can take cues from things that have happened in the past and apply them to what you might forecast in the future. So normally, Jason, when people ask me the question, what's going to happen in 10 years, I'm like, heck if I know. And if I guess, I'm going to be just as wrong as you are. So that's usually my answer. But in this case, I would say, I think it's reasonable to say that within the next decade, the idea of full autonomy is probably a no-go. The reality is no matter how far we actually think we will achieve, there will always need to be a human supervisor, whether that's for cases like the trolley experiment, or it's for cases, as Jackie said, of kind of just non-conformance. I think we're going to find ourselves in a scenario where we're going to reach a limit to the amount of lack of supervision, or the decrease in supervision. That said, I think we are finding that as we get more and more reliability out of things, as we're getting the aircraft to be far more capable, as we're getting additional sensors in the network, I do feel like we're going to reach a tipping point where the aircraft will be more capable than what a remote operator would be capable of doing. And so some of the decision-making framework will have to shift from kind of what we can actually provide to an operator in form of kind of situational intelligence to something where the aircraft is having to make effective decisions in the vast majority of those cases. And it's the only way where we can gain the kind of scale and capability and reliability that we ultimately need. Whether or not you fly up or fly down might turn into being something that's a single procedure button press. But can you even supply an operator with enough information for them to make that decision effectively? I think all of those are things, as we look at kind of human factors and how we scale and how we manage this stuff, that are going to be super critical as we move forward.
Absolutely. And Jackie, it was actually related to human factors that your comment was on, but you still totally laid out the next question perfectly, as did you, John. So I really, really appreciate that. Actually, you all did. So thank you. This one's related to, still looking into the future, what are the effects of this scaling on the workforce that is now going to be taming the autonomy related to this massive expansion worldwide that we definitely foresee? How we foresee it, who knows? You're absolutely correct. But what can we do to make sure that workers aren't being left behind? They're making that transition. How do we help the workforce make that transition, even though we don't really know what that looks like completely yet? Let's start with Glenn.
I would have preferred to start it with Jackie, but that's okay. So I would say that the first thing, looking at it from a macro standpoint, we're definitely moving from a many-to-one, or from a one-to-one to many-to-one environment, which theoretically is going to reduce the number of workers that are required. But on the flip side of that, we're dramatically increasing the demand for drones. So I think there's, a growing element to that in terms of how that adapts or how that impacts the workforce. I think that's kind of still shaking itself out. The commercial journey will get us there one way or the other. But I think that we've got a changing demand on the workforce, right? It's a growing demand for qualified people because we have a huge demand that's growing now. And as the regulations enable the next chapter of growth, we're going to need more and more trained operators. It's really creating access to a new type of job, which are inherently safer. And in some cases, it's going to help us alleviate some employee shortages in given industries. I know as we get into autonomy in the middle mile cargo sector, which is a whole different discussion, but ultimately we start taking the pressure off of the environment right now, where we're expecting to have a crewed aircraft shortage till at least 2030. From BVLOS standpoint at our company, we consider training to be core because there simply aren't enough trained professional pilot operators out there right now. And we've focused our training and also tried to create real partnerships with some of the communities that are there, like in the indigenous communities. Rather than sending pilots into the indigenous communities, we're actually in training indigenous pilots to be able to, to conduct the work when we've got work in those regions, and then ultimately employing them to do that. Doing the same thing on the defense side. We're training veterans that are coming out of a well-trained, disciplined environment and are looking for a second career operating these remotely piloted aircraft systems commercially, and ultimately that's where our focus is. But I think again, training is key. We've got to continue to make training a core part of our industry to make sure that both we have sufficient people, help people in transition, but also help them develop the professional disciplines that are addressing some of our previous topics.
And obviously this question has a little warm fuzzy in my heart because of the work I do with the nonprofit. And per your request, Glenn, let's go to Jackie next.
Okay. Well, I'm not sure. Look, I mean, there's got to be some focus still on the remote pilot, and Glenn went through that, but there's so many other opportunities within the industries. Or what, will they be? Do they need to be called pilot in the future? Are they, safety monitors or system operators? Or maintenance is a huge one. So as we move to, with drone in the box sort of conference, so we move to, flying 50 drone in the boxes at all different sites. We need that high level of robustness and system reliability. So, maintainers, and look at internal training. Like it's often focused on the 107, or in Australia it's a remote pilot's license, and you learn basic aviation and radio skills. But as we move forward to beyond visual line of sight, there's different skills required. As we move to more higher, like in risk complex, we need to learn about human factors, safety management systems, and things like that as well. So I just think we need to keep adapting to that training to what people need to know. And it's not just focused on the pilots. I believe that the whole wider drone opportunities, especially in the maintaining area.
Absolutely, couldn't have said it better. It's not just pilots. It's like drone pilot. It's a piece. Operations is a piece. Yeah. There's so much more. John, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think Glenn stole my thunder to a large degree, so thanks a lot, Glenn. But no, I would say, certainly Glenn was 100% right. There are certainly concerns that we would displace. But if you look at the scale of opportunity for this industry, I mean, the average operator we forecast might be flying, 150, 200,000 drones, right? And that's an insane number when we think about it, even if we just kind of compare it to the general aviation fleet. And so even if I am operating in a 10-to-1 or 50-to-1 or whatever kind of capacity that we are, the demand is going to be there as well. And so, drone up in terms of, potentially as a company, our first investment is in kind of the technology and the aviation and the regulatory, but our second largest investment is actually in training. Our core has always been kind of people matter most, because the reality is that we're not just driving the capabilities of, the technology in the industry, but we have to have well-trained and capable personnel. And so a really compelling upskilling program, the ability to kind of create career pathways, all of that stuff is requisite for us to be able to kind of not just be successful and not displace people from jobs, but ultimately to just be successful in this industry in general. I also think that in many ways, this is also a space where we've got significant amounts of kind of equity and inclusion that are being driven, because the barrier of entry in many cases is significantly lower. And so as we can start to bring people into the industry in a way that doesn't require, huge amounts of upfront investment, we can also continue to develop and train and qualify and certify these capabilities and build a real pathway to people for people to be able to move forward and accelerate this growth.
Wow. Yes. Amazing. Big hearts. Big hearts. Nitin, bring us home. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this question.
Yeah, I think everybody has already made some really good points. Just one thing that if you're worried about drone in a box or BVLOS affecting jobs, just think about what ChatGPT is going to do, right? AI bots and ChatGPT that is going to affect much larger number of jobs. But again, more seriously, every technology of course leads to elimination of some jobs, but also creation of new jobs. And we have seen that in last 20 years, right? 20 years ago, we used to have landline phones and we used to have so many other things that do not exist today. But at the same time, the new jobs, which are like digital marketing or AI engineer or all kinds of fancy things that people do today, all these did not exist 20 years ago. So there'll always be a churn. There'll always be kind of old jobs will go away and new jobs will come in. And as Glenn and John correctly said, that we have to focus on training and upgrading skills of our people so that we can do those higher value jobs.
One of the things that has come up several times today throughout the entire conference has been sort of public acceptance. This last question is related directly to public acceptance of this technology. So let's just get into it. It's our last question of the day, and we may have time for actual questions. So how can this industry, and I'm talking about the whole partnership, the operations, the regulators, the technology companies, how do we address the concern about safety, privacy, data security when using, drone in a box technology or these sort of automated technologies we've been talking about today? What role should companies play in building that trust with the public? Have to rock, paper, scissors this one. I'm going to start with John.
Okay, fair enough. Look, I think community engagement and acceptance is probably top of mind for pretty much anybody that's getting into something that needs to scale beyond a few flights. The reality is that if we can't drive community acceptance, we won't be able to drive, economic impact, which means all of the regulation work that we do is for nothing. And so, top of mind is that, we have to prove to people not only that we can do these things safely, but there is a viable need for it. In the case of things like package delivery, for example, it is a significantly greener option. We are creating economic impact in terms of getting vehicles off the road. And that isn't just a matter of removing congestion, but it's removing, pollution and also, decreasing the amount of stress that the average municipality needs to bear in tax burdens for things like expanding roadways, right? We have a whole bunch of three-dimensional vertical space that we can actually take advantage of. And getting people to see that and understand it has been really critical. One of the most compelling ways of doing that, I think, is engaging in early education, both for the purposes of the prior conversation, but also building public acceptance. When people see it and they see how it works and they see the safety around it, it's a lot easier to understand it. Most of what we encounter in terms of negative effects, of what we're hearing is quite honestly ignorance, right? Like they've not seen it. They make assumptions about how loud it is, or it's going to blot out the sun, or whatever those cases are. But when you really bring it down and you bring people in, you say this is what it is, and they experience it and they see it, and you go through the logic of things like, hey, even if I was flying 300,000 drones, do you know how much space there is up there? I think you can start to build compelling cases, and so that has to be a first consideration, I would say, of every organization. And the more that we do as an industry to continue to drive that and to push that forward, to help to educate people, whether it's at a municipal level or even direct community engagement, it's going to be really important. I think the art of storytelling, especially for a lot of technology and aviation companies, isn't their first, level of experience. But it is the most important thing that we can do in terms of helping people understand where we're at. And we've got to get much better at it much faster.
Jason, you're on mute.
Wow. There's some technology for you. Well, and I was waxing eloquently. It was great. Jackie, tell us a story. How do we build trust?
Look, bring people along the journey. I think John covered a lot of it, from the beginning, and all of us as this CXOs, as you like to say, use that opportunity when you're asked to speak to, educate that community, educate your sales team so they do the same as well when they're going out to the clients from the very, very beginning. It's also the responsibility. Like I know in Australia, the Department of Infrastructure do manage things like, privacy and, noise and different things like that. So I noticed a thing that they've started this year is to actually put that on a website, because people don't know what that privacy laws are, that, drones can be flying over that. This is what they can do. This is what you're expecting. This is the noise sort of level. So I think it needs to come not just from us that will be the operators, but I think it needs to come from the regulators or the government as well.
Yeah, sounds like a level of transparency is really required there. Glenn, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I see we're getting late on time, and you want to have a little bit of time for questions. So I'll keep it short on this one, because I think Jackie and John have covered a great deal. But to me, one of the key things, whether we're talking about community acceptance or community trust, and also addressing some of the tough subjects like data security and privacy concerns, and I mean that's a subject on its own, right? Understanding how to address that's probably I'm the wrong guy to comment on that as well. But I think building trust, that's an important one. And I believe the first thing we have to do is we have to communicate with the public. We have to communicate with the stakeholders, and we have to make sure that they or that we communicate and deliver the message that we understand the problem. First of all, we've got to be proactive. We've got to address those concerns up front. And I think we've used the word transparency a number of times. I think we have to be transparent in our practices, just not transparent with the data.
I completely agree. Nitin, take us home on this particular question. And I think we may have a couple questions over here. I'm looking in the comments. So.
Sounds good. So I think panelists have already covered a number of things that are very particular to drones. So when it comes to drones, of course, the noise and this and that, all those things need to be communicated, and we need to bring people on board, all of those things. But also, when you talk about data privacy or data security, a lot of these things are not unique to drone industry. The data security, data privacy are concerns for the banking sector or so many other industries that have been dealing with these things for last 20 plus years, right? And they have already built standards, and they have proven that if you comply with those standards, then people are willing to trust you, right? And those actually are effective. So basically borrowing from those other industries, things like GDPR or your SOC 2 compliance or your ISO 27001 compliance and things like that. So a lot of these things are already quite mature, and we can borrow, which can help us build that trust in terms of data privacy, data security very quickly. And then there are things that are unique to our industry where we will have to do a lot of groundwork.
Absolutely. So let's see. I'm just looking through a few questions. Let's see if there's at least one that we can pick and highlight someone. One thing, actually, I'm curious. So Melissa Dupree, thank you for this question. Is tech maintenance training something that all companies train for, like regional techs or pilots, or is it a separate organization? Like, I'd like to get someone's thought, like that has an operational knowledge. Maintenance is a thing. How big of it is a thing now versus how big is it going to be then? And do we provide that training? Who wants to take that one on?
Okay. It is a thing now. So at the moment, it's more focused on the technical specifications of an airframe. Like, you're actually physically, updating and changing something on that airframe. Where I think it needs to move towards is also software maintenance training as well. So it's really important when you start flying beyond visual line of sight, you're relying on the parameters that are put into a software, and who can change that. Like, as the remote pilot, you shouldn't be able to change some of those parameters because they're all based on levels of risk. So I do believe there needs to be, from the manufacturer, or I don't know who is going to train this in the future. It is mostly internal or through manufacturers at this stage. But I think it's going to get a lot bigger as we move forward.
And I appreciate that. And I apologize. That's all the time we have for questions. But I did want to once again thank our panelists for participating in this final CXO panel here at NestGen 23. I want to give a big shout out to DJI Enterprise for being the title sponsor of this event, and also to Volatus Aerospace, Glenn and your organization, for being the platinum sponsor for this event. This has been amazing. You guys always knocking it out of the park. Thank you so much for having me moderate. And everyone, hope you got something great out of this conference, and we will see you next year. Bye now.